Welcome to episode 32 of What's That Sound podcast. My name's Stu Watts, and today I interviewed Lachlan Goold, aka Magoo, who is a two-time ARIA award-winning producer. He is currently a mixer as well as being a lecturer at the University of the Sunshine Coast. He's worked with some absolutely iconic Australian acts such as Midnight Oil, Powderfinger, Regurgitator, Spiderbait, and heaps more. In this episode, we talked about his DIY ethic and his approach to capturing musicians as they are. Sometimes that involves leaving mistakes in, as well as his focus on making the song as strong as possible, and also the hard work that's required to being the best that you can be. As always, thanks for checking this podcast out. If you can do us a favor by sharing the podcast on your social media or in a conversation, that helps us spread the word out and get it out to as many people as possible, as well as making sure you're subscribed or following on the podcast platform that you are currently listening or watching this on. I hope you enjoy this episode, number 32 with Magoo. Let's go. You're listening to What's That Sound with your host, Stu Watts. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of What's That Sound podcast. My name's Stu Watts, and today I am here with Lachlan Goold, aka Magoo. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Stu. This is awesome.
I'm very happy to have you, and I'm looking forward to our chat and see what we can get out of this. And, you've got a long history of, working with some of Australia's greats, so very keen, very excited. So what we might do, though, to start off with is just get a bit of an about you and what you do currently.
Okay, well, do you want the OG story?
Sure, let's go for it.
Because it's a good one.
Yeah.
And I'm presuming this is the platform to tell it.
Yeah, let's go. Let's go.
So I guess it all starts, with a love for music. I kind of, grasped onto music pretty, youngish, like around 10. And, getting into like AC/DC and Kiss and things like that. I was born in 1970, so that was sort of 1980 when Kiss Dynasty was the thing.
Yeah.
And, then getting into high school, I started maybe turning more to alternative music, probably through David Bowie, like Let's Dance, and then exploring some of his more earlier works. Mm-hmm. And that kind of started leading to the independent record stores in Brisbane, the import record stores.
Cool.
And also to like a friend's brother's record collection that was littered with the Ramones albums. Fantastic. And it kind of just opened this door to sort of punk and Australian indie music, which was kind of huge at the time. Well, it was certainly big in the import record store. Yeah. And I spent a lot of my high school years spending any extra money I had buying import records. So things like The Scientists and they're Australian, The Birthday Party, but also like the Ramones. We collected all the Ramones albums between us, and you could only get them on import.
Yeah.
That kind of led to an interest in, particularly punk rock, an interest in having a crack. That's the best part about punk rock. It's DIY, have a go.
Yep.
So me and a mate started learning guitar, and I often say this is my first decision as a producer, and that was that I was a pretty shit guitar player.
Okay.
I could do it, Perhaps it's actually my mate got a really cool guitar teacher and I got a really daggy one. He would sort of walk in with Ramones songs, which honestly are so easy to work out. But he would walk in with Blitzkrieg Bop and go, "Oh, can you teach me how to play this?" And he would teach him how to play it. And meanwhile, I had a guitar teacher who was teaching me to sight read, and I was playing Creedence Clearwater Revival and the Beatles, which at the time I just hated. I was not into it at all. I'm a massive Beatles nut now, but back then that was not part of what we were into, and I just kind of didn't. I guess I didn't practice much. I just didn't take to it. But my friend did, and he started a band, and I actually had an ARIA SG copy. That was my guitar, and I had an amp. And probably the key here was he didn't have an amp, but he was in a band. So, I'm talking like I'm 15 here.
Yeah, yep.
And this is Brisbane in the 80s. It was kind of, Joe Bajoki Peterson was still in, and, corruption was rife, and it was fine for sort of 15, 16-year-olds to be hanging out in pubs.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're in the right pub.
Yep.
If you're in the wrong pub, you'd get arrested. And, particularly white skin, suburban kid, you were fine. So he started playing in these bands and would, they were getting a few gigs, and I would loan them my amp. So I kind of became the roadie for the band.
Cool.
And that kind of led to doing lights for the band. And I remember doing lights at the Orient Hotel in Brisbane, where the light show was literally a piece of wood with 4 light switches on it, and you were just turning the light switches on and off in time with the music. They were cans up on the stage, but they were just regular light switches.
Yeah.
So Brisbane was pretty dark back in the mid to late 80s, and doing lights and stuff, kind of, the light desk was always next to the sound desk, and it kind of had me sort of looking at the console, kind of going, well, maybe I can do that. And it probably led, through high school, that was kind of through high school. And then after school, I started a mechanical engineering degree.
Right.
I kind of did what my father wanted me to do, went to university, which he never did. And I was doing that, but I kind of was still just addicted to music and going to gigs every weekend. And I had a good mate, Jeff Lovejoy, and he did a sound course at a place called Pyramid, which was in the Target building in the Valley in Brisbane.
Right, yep.
Which was an old, it was a Target department store. It was like the biggest department store for a while in Brisbane. Yep. But it had left and abandoned this building, and musicians moved in, and you could hire a space there really cheap. And there was a recording studio in there, and they mainly did jingles, but sort of, so for 6 months, it was 20 weeks, I did a course. It was 3 hours a week. And basically it was just running you through signal flow, and we recorded one song, I think. So this was around 3rd year of the engineering degree.
Yep.
And I did this course, and of course I loved it. I was kind of addicted to the sound thing.
Yeah, yep.
And throughout the course, so many of the people in the course, I don't even know what they were doing there. They just sort of weren't that interested. There was probably 2 of us that were really into it.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, the guy said, "Look, you've got an ear for this. You should probably think about pursuing this." So I kind of took that on and went, "Oh, great." And at the same time, I'd done a subject in mechanical engineering called noise and vibrations.
Cool.
So it was just the physics of sound, basically.
That's pretty cool.
And I went from, in the engineering degree, went from getting passes and credits, like just floating, just skating through, to this one subject I got a HD.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, okay, I'm getting a bit of a sign here.
Yeah.
This is all in this 2-week period.
Right.
This would have been 1990, in the middle of 1990.
Cool.
And there's a third moment here where a mate, I called up a mate. I saw a thing in the local street press that Marshall were having, they were releasing the JCM 900. So it's 1990. They're having a product launch at a pub, and there was a door prize of a Yamaha 4-track.
Cool.
And, so they basically had someone on stage shredding while playing to backing tracks on this 4-track. And at the end of the night, they're going to pull a name out of the hat and you'd win the 4-track.
That's cool.
And I thought, no one's going to go to this. I reckon there's a good chance that I'm going to win the 4-track. So I went. I had no intentions to buy a JCM 900. So I went with my mate and they drew my name out of the hat.
Unreal.
So it was kind of my ticket. So I had a 4-track recorder and I just started doing demos for bands.
Yep.
And, it's kind of that 2-week moment really sort of said to me, this is what you should be doing.
That's so cool.
But at the same time, I still finished my degree.
Sure.
But because I did this course, I started mixing live, although live sound was not a part of the course, but I just assumed that I could do that.
Yep.
So obviously there was a lot to learn. I just learnt on the job and usually did walk-ins where I didn't have to tune the PA or set it up. And eventually I learnt how to do that, but, So I was mixing live while I was studying. I finished my degree like a good boy. And I actually tried to get a job in the noise and vibrations field, and I sort of, I did there was a research subject at the end, and I did that. I kind of focused on that, and there was just no work. It was it was what Paul Keating described as the recession we had to have.
Sure.
It was sort of in 1990, but in 1991, businesses were not hiring graduates.
Yeah, right, yep.
So it kind of just led me down the sound road, and I got a job at a studio called Red Zeds, which was 5 rehearsal rooms and a recording studio.
Yep.
And it was very Brisbane styled. When I say a recording studio, it was a 24-track, 1-inch Tascam.
Yep.
Tape machine with a Tascam console. Wasn't floating floors.
Yep.
The studio was a distance away from the rehearsal rooms, but not enough that the rumble didn't come through. So the high pass filter was always in on the desk, except on the kick drum. But it was kind of getting that job where my job initially was just looking after the rehearsal rooms, serving chips and drinks to the bands and getting the PAs going. But part of it was once everyone was up and rehearsing, you could just hang out in the recording studio and wait till someone beckoned you back to the counter.
Yeah.
So I did that for a year, and then after a year I ended up being kind of, I guess, what was called the demo boy, where you'd get whatever jobs came in through the door that no one else wanted to do. Yep. So that's kind of where it all started. Days. Yeah.
Well, I think I can relate to some of that stuff. I grew up on punk rock as well. My friend had a 4-track recorder that we used to demo our tracks on. I didn't get any jobs in any recording studios until now, but until 2019 when I started working here at Marshall Street. But before that, it was I had my own 16-channel Mackie interface that I was able to use as a live desk as well. But I was mixing live and all that sort of stuff. But I think the great thing about, and what I can relate to, is when you get those sorts of, small pieces of gear like a 4-track or something, or when you're in a pub and you're just starting to learn about sound and all the gear and that sort of thing, you get it from a really kind of grassroots kind of angle. You're not necessarily taught all of the ins and outs, even though, you learnt in that environment, that schooling environment, somewhat alongside that, you do get a very grassroots and kind of DIY way of going about things. And I think it influences a lot of what we do now when we have been doing it for a long time. What do you think about that?
It's never left me. So like that 4-track, I got as much as possible out of that 4-track, and it was that 4-track that got me the first job. So what I used to do was I would do demos for the bands, and I would say to them, look, you know, if you just book a session on a Saturday afternoon when it's really quiet, all the other rooms are empty, so we can grab mics from all those rooms. I'll grab another mixing desk and I'll do fully mic up the band and do a pre-mix and put it on one track.
Great.
And then I'll put, the guitars on another track and then the vocals, and then we'll bounce all of that to one track. So I'd make up these really sophisticated kind of multi-track recordings on this 4-track cassette, which are pretty shit. But
and did you learn that from someone, or was that something that you were just like, I wonder if I could do this, and it just sort of worked?
A bit of column A, column B, because my mate Jeff, he had a 4-track as well. He had a really nice Akai one. But it was more through the manual. I kind of learnt how to bounce. And, there was a graphic EQ on it, and you could bounce through the graphic EQ and get everything right. And my mate Jeff, I would borrow 4 tracks that he'd done and I would mix them. And I just, play around with things, trying to work out how to get a good mix. And that kind of taught me about what to put on each track and the best way to get a good sound. So,
and I'm guessing, also studying the engineering stuff, there would have been a lot of, scientific research-based teaching, which probably led you to go, I wonder if I can understand these pieces of gear fully before I actually, apply, I guess, use them properly from the start.
At the time, I didn't really put 2 and 2 together. I didn't really link the two so much, like the physics of sound and the audio engineering bit. Like when I studied the audio engineering stuff, it was very pragmatic. It was just, here's a microphone, you plug it in the wall over there, and then it comes up in the patch bay over there, and then you hit record. It wasn't like, this is how a diaphragm works. I can't even remember being told the difference between dynamic and condenser. So it was very pragmatic, and I just, part of it is just, I guess, my brain. I was very, I obviously had that maths and physics bit with engineering, but then I was also very creative, and I kind of just put the two together, and kind of out the other end comes Magoo. But back to your initial thing, the DIY thing, very, very important with Brisbane, and it's something that I kind of continue to look at today, which kind of brings us back around to the first question of like, what are you doing today? And I now, I'm a lecturer in music at the University of the Sunshine Coast. I mainly teach production, but I also do a bit of songwriting and performance and live sound and just whatever's needed. But I've found just the scene in Brisbane, it's very different to Melbourne and Sydney. It's always been very DIY, and that's always been a part of my approach to the recording studio.
Well, I obviously want to get into some of the stuff that you've worked on and kind of break that down a bit. But while we're still in the early days, what sort of things were you listening out for when you were recording? Were you having a very much of a producer hat on at that time, or did that develop a lot kind of as time went on with songwriting and, arrangement and things like that? Was it much in your head when you were doing those early jobs?
No. I've really, so, I often say, like I'm not a musician, but, like I am, it's, I'll take that Brian Eno, like the studio is my instrument, the sort of Brian Eno approach. But I'm happy to let musicians be musicians and let them do their thing. But initially, early on, I really just think I was learning how to engineer. And in Brisbane, there wasn't really that process of assisting you know, some legendary producer. You know, it happened very, very few times, a few assistant gigs, but generally it was Jeff, my mate, and myself, and we were just trying to work it out together.
Yeah.
Like he would have a session and I'd talk to him about it, and then I'd have a session and we'd play it to each other and talk about sounds. Like this is before YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
This is before the internet. So all we had was Sound on Sound. It was even before Audio Technology magazine.
Yeah,
there was Mix magazine. You know, there was just a few magazines, a few skerricks, and we would learn little bits as we went.
Yeah.
And you know, I just learnt on the job. But the one thing I did learn was that you could make things sound better if you organise the parts. Like often people come in, they're playing too much, they're really busy, and you just can't, there's just no space for the sound. So I worked out that reducing people's parts, trimming the fat is kind of the best way to kind of make things sound good. And that kind of, you know, led me to kind of arranging a lot more and sitting with bands in band rooms and suggesting, oh, maybe we should halve that bit or double that bit and we'll turn this bit off there. And I think also console automation really led the way a lot in maybe arranging things while you're mixing, which was kind of something I was never afraid to do. And I think in Brisbane there were a lot of people, because it was very DIY based and it didn't have that kind of foundation of knowledge really, of like having these really experienced producers to show younger people what to do. We were all working it out by ourselves. But I think the one thing was, I was never afraid to just jump in and try stuff. And, you know, I think for some engineers in town, in Brisbane at that stage, would have been afraid to hit the mute button on someone that they've recorded throughout the whole song.
Sure.
But I'm like, hey, it's going to be better for the song. And, you know, you talk to the band and they go, yeah, that sounds great. And, you know, so I kind of got a name for perhaps doing what the band wanted and not so much what was in the engineer's book. And it's, you know, it was also a very fertile scene.
Well, I mean, I think here is where we could probably list off some of the artists that, you know, you've worked with, you know, bands such as Regurgitator. Obviously, you're kind of known as being somewhat of an extra member of Regurgitator. You've pretty much worked on all their stuff, right? Is that accurate to say?
Oh, well,
a lot of it.
Yeah, a lot of the record company era.
Right. Okay.
Because that being true DIY, they do a lot of it themselves these days. Yeah.
And then, you know, some of the other bands, huge names like Powderfinger, Midnight Oil, Spiderbait, Art versus Science, Butterfingers. And one of my favourite albums, Front End Loader, The Last of the V8 Interceptors. I love that album so much.
Oh, what?
That's somewhat
fantastic.
Unknown, but you know, all of these bands, they've, you know, Aussie alternative, like you said, it was so fertile in the 90s. It was somewhat abstract. Like when you listen to it now, I listen to it now and it's like the arrangements of the music, it's not just this standard verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end. It's kind of all over the place. And, you know, I want to know how much of that you had a part of. Were you involved in the arrangement of the songs, or was it kind of like these bands had these songs and you were just like, yep, sounds great, let's put it to tape? Or
bit of column A, column B. Like I have been very much as a producer, I kind of really only want to step in when I feel like there's something either not working or that could be better. And you know, like I often, sometimes my naivety around musical theory is an advantage because I'll just say to the band, look, something's not working here. Can we sort of try and fix this bit? And that then leaves the ownership to the band. They're either going to agree and go, oh yeah, I see what you mean, yeah, and they talk amongst each other and go, hey, let's let's try this. And then I'm like, yeah, that's it. That's perfect. You know, so, but they take ownership over the part, even though I've steered it, they'll take ownership over that sort of change. But generally I'll only want to step in when I feel like something could be better or something's gone wrong, and I'll make a suggestion. Very rarely am I making the suggestion that is like the thing.
Yeah, sure.
Over time, I've gotten really well involved in arrangements, but things like Front End Loader, they were supreme arrangers. Like Pete is incredible at sort of arranging the bits of the songs and how they all go, and Regurgitator as well, you know, pretty amazing at arranging songs. Although I guess they're probably one of the bands where I probably had more creative input than some of the others, you know, where I'll get in and, you know, totally change things when I'm mixing or wherever. So, yeah, for me, I've always just been kind of addicted to the sound of records and good records. And it's through that I, you know, like that's where I'll make a suggestion to change an arrangement or to change a part. It'll be like, it's just not clear enough, or it's getting in the way of the vocals or whatever.
Yeah, I love it. So when it comes to working with all these different styles of bands, you know, crossing genres, some of them are more pub rock sort of stuff, some of it's electronic based. Do you have kind of a generic approach to how you work with bands from the start until, you know, when you finish working with them, or is it dependent on the members, what music they're into and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's definitely, I'll take it project by project. Well, you know, I don't do a lot of recording these days. I'm mainly just mixing. But, you know, if I think back to when I was recording a lot, you know, there's obviously things I like to do. One thing that I did start to like doing probably post-Unit by Regurgitator was recording one song at a time. Which may not seem that radical now, but back then it was definitely it was just the way the system worked, because you'd be booking out a studio for 3 weeks or 6 weeks or something. You'd want to get the record done in that time, and often that led to, let's record all the drums for the record, and let's record all the bass for the record, or now we'll overdub all the guitars. And I just always felt like it was like a sausage factory. And when we were doing Unit, the band didn't have any songs. They had 2 songs, so we recorded those 2 songs and then went, right, what are we going to do now? And they said, Magoo, you mix those songs and we'll write some more. And
awesome.
The whole process was kind of like it sort of it helped guide the whole record, because we had a couple of songs finished, and then actually Everyday Formula got mastered and then was being played on Triple J while we were, I think we were four or 5 songs into the record.
Yeah, wow.
So we were, you know, when you get a few runs on the board, it kind of just, it just helped build everyone's confidence, and they kind of knew what the record was going to sound like.
Yes.
Whereas like before that, it just felt like you wouldn't know what the record would sound like until you're in the final 4 days where you're trying to get someone to sing for 4 days straight. And invariably the last 2 days would just suck.
Yeah.
And you'd have to blow it out and do something else and then come back in. And I just hated it. So my ethos was always try and keep everyone involved all the time.
Yeah.
So, and that means the drummer. Keep them there, you know, try and record a drum track like in the final bit of the recording session. And, you know, try and record a vocal as soon as you can. So that's probably something I'd try, but it didn't always happen like that. Like, you know, some bands.
I guess with that sort of approach as well, it kind of keeps the whole writing process somewhat fresh, and you're kind of really able to focus on the song and make the song as strong as it possibly is, rather than looking at it as a whole album and being like, let's make the album great, but maybe you're not paying as much attention to each individual, part of every section of every song. And so to me, that shows in an album like Unit, where each song has its own sound. It's like, it's diverse, and each song is so strong, and why it's still known as being such a classic album, I guess.
Yeah, well, with Regurgitator, like, that was very intentional. We were trying, they were trying to regurgitate popular culture and twist it, usually with the lyrics, let's make this sound like the Beatles, but we'll sing about the, pornographization of, marketing in general, So, and there'll be, obviously lots of swearing and all of that kind of stuff in the middle of this kind of beautiful sounding pop song. So that was always their thing, but I definitely took that with me, and I was always trying to make a song sound as good as the song possibly could and do what the song needed. I didn't really care too much about an album aesthetic so much. I really liked each song having an individual sound, and when I was in studios, I'd be like, okay, yeah, we might record one or two songs, we'll do the beds, and then we'll overdub some vocals and, overdub on the songs, and we'll get a couple finished and everyone's feeling good. And it's like, okay, let's record some more. And I'm like, right, let's move the drum kit and put it in a different spot just to make it sound different. And I'll put 3 mics on it instead of 10 and just really kind of change things up. And I wouldn't do it just for the sake of it. I'd be doing it because that's what I thought that song kind of called for. And I kind of always really enjoyed that sort of, perhaps, very different to that American kind of, like Green Day, where they'll spend 2 weeks just getting a drum sound and then hit record for the drums for the whole record. So I certainly wasn't into that.
That's also what's like a lot of fun in the mixing process as well, when you have vastly different sounds and you're trying to, I guess, collate it into a cohesive thing for the album. But it's so much fun when you've only got 3 mics, like you were saying, on a drum kit. It's like, okay, now I've got to try and get the best sound out of these 3 mics, and you're limiting yourself and you're kind of forcing yourself into a sound that you maybe can't do as much with, but gives it such a unique sort of character.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've always, tried to chase the character in a song, and that's kind of, that appeals to me more than it sounding pristine or perfect. And I really encourage students now to limit your options because, there's still so many options. Like you can record it, like the Black Keys will record 1 mic. And then, Chad Blake's going to go through and use Drumagog to put kick and snare samples on everything, and it still sounds fucking awesome,
100%.
So there's still so many options when you limit yourself. Yeah. So, like I feel kind of lucky that I started working on tape. Yeah. But when you were working on tape, you worked really hard to try and create options. You had 24 tracks, when you're lucky with a big budget recording, you might have 2 24 tracks synced up. But generally I was working on 24 track, and you would do everything you could to create options, when you're mixing or like basically leaving those options for the end. But now it's all about reducing those options because there's you can just do whatever you want, and
and every different plugin having the thousands of sounds you can obtain by just putting one different plugin on, or even all the plugins that have multi-effects and all this sort of, like, you could really just sit there and waste time. And so it's really important to narrow those options for sure.
Yeah, it's super important to narrow, like, and I would say to people starting out that in the same way that with the 4-track, I just squeezed every little bit of sound that I could out of that thing. Limit your plug-in choice. Maybe just choose a few and try and get as much as you can out of those plugins.
Yeah.
And then when you're bored of those, look for something else.
Find a new one, yeah.
You can always you can always try what you would normally do and then go, oh, instead of using FabFilter, I'm going to use an SSL emulation and see what that does.
Yeah.
And if you can make it better, then go for it, So it's that kind of thing of just trying to keep yourself interested and try and keep your workflow efficient. It's really easy to get lost, particularly when you've got thousands of plugins, at the studios at the university, the plugin list is just ridiculous.
Yep.
And for a new student walking in and they look at EQ and there's like 500 different EQs, they're like, why?
Which fucking one do I choose, man?
Yeah. And what's the difference? They all turn up the treble or turn up the bass,
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much for listening so far. There is plenty more to come, so don't go anywhere. I just wanted to let you know that this podcast is made completely independently by myself with no sponsors. So if you like what you hear and you would like to show your support, you can send a donation to the PayPal link, paypal.me/whatsthatsound. The link is also in the show notes. Thanks so much for your support, and let's get back to it.
Now, we've kind of been talking very broadly about the overall approach to, working with artists and things like that. But I kind of want to get a little bit more nitty gritty into, when you're, first of all, we'll do producing. When you were producing a lot more, was there key things that you were, analyzing and looking for when you first start working with a band and throughout the process? And then we'll talk about mixing.
Yeah, well, I guess it always starts with pre-production, listening to demos and just trying to see if the song makes sense. So, is it in the right key? Is it the right tempo? All that kind of usual stuff.
Yeah.
And I usually try and see if I can write out the arrangement.
Yeah.
And it helps me, one, stay engaged with the song, and it's like, oh, what bit am I in now? Is this the verse? I don't know. This bit's different. This isn't the verse. Where am I? And then, and thinking, trying to take my kind of producer hat off and just think about it as a listener. And then if there's something that I feel is a bit weird or whatever, talk to the band about it. Talk to the artist, like, when I was listening to this bit here really kind of jarred and didn't really work for me. But then the artist might say, oh, but I'm trying to do that here. This is the narrative of the song and there's this jarring bit, And I'm like, oh, that's great. So then often if I felt like a bit confused or something in there, I'll be thinking that it's not obvious enough. So when we're recording it, I'll be trying to make it as jarring as possible, doing whatever I can. So it's that kind of thing. I always listening to it without the artist, writing down your thoughts and then talking to the artist, making sure that each part makes sense and has a purpose.
Yeah.
So that when you're in the studio, you can be thinking about the sounds and you can still let things become their own thing and they might change. But you've got a pretty good map of what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And, like when we're talking sort of back earlier on about the earlier stuff, after Unit, I went through this long spate of not doing that.
Right.
So, because Unit, there were no songs when we went in and, invariably we recorded a few songs twice because the first version was shit or the first version was good and then just not what they were looking for. But because of the success of that record, a lot of people got me in without there being proper demos. Oh, Magoo will work without demos. So like Midnight Oil, they didn't have demos. Right. They were sick of demoing. They said for Blue Sky Mining, they did demos for 9 months. And by the time they went to the studio, they hated the songs.
Yeah, that's fair enough if you're working on it for 9 fucking months.
Yeah. And that's because the record company are like, I just don't hear the single yet, and they kind of keep pushing. Wow. So, the Spiderbait record, no demos. Oh, there were demos, but they were pretty scratchy. So I just went through this whole spate of working with bands with no demos. And when I look back on it, I think Unit was the only record that worked. You know, there was some moments on those other records, but it was Unit just worked because of what it was.
And so can you kind of talk through that more when it comes to like, are you part of the songwriting of the song, or are you sitting back and letting them just play and going, that bit, what was that? Do that again, or, you know?
Well, I can't say that hasn't happened. That's happened a lot. But with Unit, though, it was more or less because there's the two songwriters. You've got Ben and Quan. We'd record a Quan song, and then Quan would go away and we'd record a Ben song. And then we'd call up Quan and say, hey, man, come in, you've got to play some guitar.
Right.
And he'd play some guitar. He'd play us a demo of what he's been working on. And then he'd probably go home and finish it because, like, you know, some of, like, you know, I Will Lick Your Asshole, so many words. Like, you know, it took him ages to write that. And so, you know, I'd finish off Ben's song, and by the time I've mixed it, Quan would come in with another song to track, and then Ben would go away and write. And invariably a lot of Quans were sequenced and, you know, very intricate, where Ben's were a bit more jammed and in the studio.
Yeah, cool.
So, like, Regurgitator really liked, they were pretty good at arranging the ideas themselves. I would pipe in every now and then.
Yep.
And like I said, would make decisions on the console. But most of the time they were doing it themselves, and I would just run around moving mics and changing things around while they're jamming.
Sure.
But invariably, like, Quan hated jamming, so it kind of just slowly stopped the whole sort of jamming thing.
Sounds to me like there's like a lot of trust kind of in each other in that sort of a process where it's like, yeah, I mean, you do your song, I'll do mine, we'll see what happens. And it's not like, oh, I don't care. It's like, no, I love your songs. You know, that's kind of what it sounds like to me.
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of trust amongst everyone. And I sort of think trust is the main, I was going to call it a commodity, but it's the main thing that you've got in the studio. You've got to have that trust with one another. And it's something, I think in Brisbane, it was very, very common in amongst all the recording studios when I was starting. There was always this lack of trust. It was us and them with the studio engineer. It was like they wanted to do what was correct and right, and they wouldn't let the meters go into the red, and they couldn't record with distortion. And along comes Magoo, who goes, I don't give a fuck. Let's just do whatever the song needs, you know?
Yeah.
And that invariably led to people trusting me to do what the band wanted. So there was a lot of trust with Regurgitator. They trusted each other, and they're always just looking out for the song. No one really cared who played bass or who played drums or who played guitar. It was just whatever made the song better. So that's what we were always trying to do, yeah.
Sounds like so much fun to be fair. Like, I love those times in the studios when you just go with it, and someone comes up with something, it's just like, just go, just do it, just lay it down and we'll see what happens. And there's not like, oh, but I'm supposed to be playing guitar or whatever. Like, that really isn't conducive to a good session. Do you have those sorts of moments that you have to navigate? Or is there any that you can remember that you've had to be really like, guys, we need to just focus on the actual song here?
Yeah, those things always pop up. And like, not every band is like that, where it's like, people are happy to change instruments to do whatever's right for the song.
Yeah.
But, you know, in saying that, I'm always wanting to get the best out of the artist. And if that's a bit shit, that's a bit shit. That's what the band sounds like. I'm not going to go in and, you know, completely change things. I might edit a bit harder maybe.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm also talking about on tape, you know, like if you couldn't get a great performance out of someone, but people liked the band and wanted to hear a recording, that's how it goes. Like, I'll get a better performance. I'll get the performance that is them on their best night times 3, you know, and edit them together. But, you know, I'm not going to replay the part or like, and there were people around town that would do that. Like, the band's gone home, the part's a bit shit, let's just replay it, and they'll never know. I kind of just wasn't into that. I was happy to let something be a bit garagey and loose if it needed to be. And I still have that same ethos in Pro Tools or you know, the DAW. You know, I'm not always going to jump on Auto-Tune or Melodyne. I will if it takes me out of the song, I'm going to try and tune it. But if something's a bit out of tune, I'm not that fast. And the listener is not that fast. I feel like we're still in this kind of loop where everyone feels like everything needs to be perfect, and it doesn't.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree 100%. One thing, you know, that always stands out to me for music in general is like when you hear those little intricacies, if the drum sound isn't perfect, if they're a little bit out of time and it grabs your attention in a good way, you're like, oh, that was kind of weird. What was that? That's always, to me, way more enjoyable than hearing every band sound the same because they've all been like, you know, I edit to grid a lot, but it's like you don't want every drum sound to be exactly the same because that's what that genre sounds like or something like that. It just, to me, you lose that experience with the artist because it's, you know, we all grew up loving putting on headphones and just losing yourself to music. And I think those sorts of experiences are few and far between now because of that way of recording. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, you know, I think I've already mentioned Brian Eno once. Like I love the oblique strategies, and one of them is the honour thy mistake as hidden intention. And, you know, I just love that one because mistakes are often the best part. And often, yeah, I'm very much, I've often kind of used the Sylvia Massey approach where you sort of get the bed of the song down, you get the fundamental bits down. We've recorded the song, but now there's a bit of time left over. Let's fuck shit up. Let's kind of, you know, experiment for a while.
Yeah.
And, you know, and even try and create mistakes. And, you know, it's more about not so much kind of pointing out, oh, that's a mistake. It's more about going, oh, no, that bit's really good. Let's leave it in there, whether it's intended or not. And I kind of love that shit. It's the stuff that like kind of really draws me into recording is those kind of moments.
Well, let's talk mixing. You say you're mostly doing a lot of mixing these days. Do you have a kind of go-to approach where you always attack one thing first and get that down and then move on to the next thing? Or is it kind of let the song speak to me and I'll go to what I think needs attention first?
Yeah, mixing's definitely different from what it used to be, and that's fine. That's just how things go. I am a bottom-up guy. Try and don't quote me out of context. You know, I'll start from the kick drum and move my way across. But generally, you know, because I'm usually mixing things that I haven't recorded, I'll generally be listening through it. You know, I'll start with the bass drum and listen through it, and I might chuck a plug in on it really quickly as if I was tracking it and kind of going, how do I want that bass drum to sound? Just put something on it quickly, move along, put the snare up, and I'll just sort of try and get the song up really quickly and try and recreate the rough mix. I like to get a rough mix. Have all my faders kind of sitting in a static mix, and then I almost start again. And I'll go through and go, right, okay, the bass drum needs this. I'll kind of have a better idea of what it needs and where it's sitting in the mix. I don't like soloing much. And it's not like I'll sit on the bass drum for ages, but I'll just sort of start again on the drums, and then I'll start again on the bass, and then kind of just move through it and just jump around everywhere. And it's that part I kind of have always done. Like once I've got a bit of a foundation happening, I'll just jump around. I still miss the console. I used to love, you know, tweaking the vocal and then leaning over and tweaking the snare drum at the same time, which you can't really do anymore. But, you know, the recall is just incredible. I just, you know, it's that whole thing that you can always jump back into where you were and tweak it. I've always been a tweaker, and that's probably my downfall with the DAW is you
the ease
just
of
keep
tweakability.
tweaking. Yeah.
That's it. And so, you know, when you get, say, some stems or multi-tracks, when you're listening for it at the start, is there times where you're like, this isn't where I need it to be? And have you had to kind of go back to the artist and be like, we need to fix that up? Or is it always like, no, I'm just going to work with what I've got and get the best out of it as I possibly can?
Like, it depends on the gig. Hey, I just want to back up there and just try and fix the system.
Okay.
Because I like the way you said stems or multi-track.
Yeah.
Can we just say multi-track from now on?
Yeah.
Because stems is something different.
Yeah.
And everyone, when they say stems, they mean the multi-track.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to fix the system one student at a time.
Yeah.
And now, you know, maybe if there's other people out there starting out, listening out, it's the multi-track. Stems is a pre-mix of like the drums. That's the stem. There might be a drum stem. There might be a bass stem, guitar stem. They're not the individual tracks. Anyway.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
So to answer your question though, it depends on the gig. Depends on, you know, if I've taken it on, usually I'll feel like it's ready. Mm-hmm. I like to hear things before I start. But sometimes it's just about dealing with what you got and trying to present it in the best way possible. You know, you just got to do your best. So that's depends on the gig.
That's fair. And is there kind of, can you remember any specific times when you've done a mix and completed a mix and been like, this is amazing, this is like the best work I've ever done? And what is it about those sorts of, you know, times? Is there certain elements, or is it the song itself? Expand on that for me.
Yeah, it's definitely the song. You know, I like to think that every time you do a mix, you always, you know, feel like you've pushed yourself to do the best thing you've ever done. But generally, it's when the production, the song, and the mix all kind of link in together. That's when, you know, you kind of go, yeah, I nailed this one, you know. And it doesn't, you know, it's a rare thing. It doesn't always happen. And sometimes it even, you know, I find as a mixer, because you're a bit disconnected from the project, you're not like, you know, when you're a producer, you're like part of the band, you're really involved in it, you're trying to push every part and get everything you can out of every performance. And then the mix is just another part of that. But when you're mixing it, sometimes I did a project recently called We Are the Kill Sounds. I think that's what they're called. Anyway, it's the guitar player from a band called Violatine from the 90s. Sure. And I kind of was doing some mixes, and then Sean, the guitar player, kept kind of referencing some other mixes that I'd done for him. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really realise it at the time, but I'd go back to that mix, you know, and I'm 3 or 4 mixes along, and I'd go back to this other mix and have a listen and go, how did I do that? That just sounds awesome. I don't know if I can make that sound as good as that, you know. So it's just that sort of thing. Like, I really do love getting lost in a song and connecting with it and just slotting everything into the right spot. And it's a hard thing to kind of, you know, particularly when I'm now teaching students, like trying to show them the way and show them how to do it. It's actually quite intangible, and sometimes, you know, I don't want to use the word magic, but I guess I just did. You know, it just feels like everything comes together and you've nailed it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I love what you mentioned about, and I've talked about it before, where, you know, I listen back to mixes from 5 years ago, and it's like, how did I do those drums? I love that feeling, because, you know, you feel like you've come away, you know, you've like, okay, well, now I know what I'm doing a little bit more when I approach drums and stuff like that. But yeah, there's something about that vibe of that drum kit that I don't think I'd be able to reproduce today, but it's all about that, because you'll do the same thing in 5 years again, and you'll be like, what was I doing then? I've got different plugins, I've got different mics, I've got different band members, whatever it might be. I love that feeling as well. So there's something to that.
Yeah. We're always trying to move forward, but sometimes you got to look back and go, oh, actually, when things were simpler, it was pretty good.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. Now, with, going through the education system and working a lot with younger people, is there kind of something or, a mindset that you see regularly that you maybe want to kind of address and be like, let's focus more on this instead of this? Do you think there are some people that are just starting out that tend to focus on the wrong areas, and, how do you address those sorts of things?
Well, yeah, like, good question, because I see a lot of students approach particularly studying audio engineering wrong. And really, and part of that is just the framework of the higher education system, so whether you're at SAE or JMC or at a university, you get sort of drawn into this kind of like, there's 13 weeks of teaching and then there's this big assignment due and I do that and then it's the holidays and I do nothing for a month. I know some places are on trimesters and there's less of a break. But really, learning audio engineering, it doesn't matter where you are or who's teaching you, it's all about doing it. The more you do it, the more you learn. Like, I learned pretty much everything myself. Yeah. And of course I picked up things along the way, and now there's YouTube, it's fantastic, and you can, if you've got the time, you can sit down and learn this, that and the other. But you learn so much by doing things on the job. And if you are studying at one of those institutions, it's as much as, there's some amazing teachers out there now, which is great. But I think it's way more important is the networks of people that you're with, the musicians, the other sound engineers and producers, and it's also the time and access to the equipment. Like, get in there on the holidays and do it. I'm always telling my students, I can still remember filling out the census one year, and I was disappointed. There was only 2 boxes for how many hours did you work this, in the last month. And I'm like, I was working 99 hours a week. Like, I did more than that. 99 was not enough to pick up how many hours of work I was doing. Yep. And it's because I loved it. I was just basically in the studio, working or sleeping, Somehow I managed to maintain a relationship through all of this. That's probably the other thing that's really, really important. But it's just getting in there and doing it and taking advantage of access to the studios wherever you are. Whenever I'm, at work, and if I see the studios empty, it just brings a tear to my eye. It's like they're amazing studios. When you've left university, to use those studios, it's going to cost you like $800, $1,000 a day. Yeah. Get in there, use it. Don't let that time sort of go to waste. And that's where you learn. From me, you're just going to hear tips and approaches and all the rest. It'll help, but you learn so much just by doing it yourself.
100%. And I can relate to that. When I went to TAFE for a couple of years, and me and a couple of my mates, one of whom I'm still like really great mates with, we were always in there trying to get as much out of those studios as possible. And, obviously doing the wrong things and not using the right mics in the right places and all this sort of stuff. But that's the sort of stuff that you need to do to understand, like, okay, I'm going to eliminate that from my decision-making in the future. But the other thing that I tend to see these days working in a studio full-time is you get people inboxing you or emailing you and being like, hey, man, I want to come in. I want to get some experience. I'm happy to sit in there and this and that. And it's like, great. I love getting those emails, but the lack of follow-through and the lack of hassle me. I want you to be in my face every week being like, hey, is there any time I can come in the studio these days? You'll get one response and then they disappear. And it's like, you're not that keen about it. It's like, you have to really want to do it. And I never did the assistant approach. I was always trying to figure it out by myself, but it's the same thing. I would work in retail and I would be hassling people that I worked with. Hey, you're in a band. I want to record you. Like, I don't understand how, you can't want to keep following through and hassling people about that stuff.
Yeah, and particularly if you're at university just studying music, that's a pretty fun subject. You should be into it,
Absolutely.
It's very different to when I was studying engineering. I totally get you get through a semester, you do all your assignments, you're exhausted. But, like in the music industry, I don't know, that just happens all the time. Every kind of project is like an assignment, and you get to the end of it, you're a bit tired, have a few days off, start again, You just, and it's also, as you were saying before, making mistakes, those mistakes, that's when you learn. You don't learn anything if you don't make mistakes. And as I was saying earlier, sometimes the mistakes are the best bits.
Yep.
So you got to just get in there, plug things in and make a noise. And do you like that noise? That's the question. Yeah. Is it any good?
Really is. And it's still like that. It's still like that when you're like producing a band. Yeah, you're like, hey, that's weird. I love it. Or I hate it. Let's get rid of it. Yeah, it's exactly the same question. And you learn stuff every time you do a new project, like working with different artists. You might see a new personality that you didn't see last time, or, the way people interact. It's like, oh, that's great. Or the way someone sets up their guitar rig or anything like that. It's just all these little pieces of those puzzles that you can use in the future.
It's probably the one thing I miss the most is the traveling around and going to lots of different studios, because I learnt so much by just going to a different studio and seeing how how another studio's set up or whatever. I'd always learn something new and bring that back, or I'd go, I've got to buy this piece of gear now, and I'd buy some sort of new box or whatever. But that's sort of one thing I miss. Yeah.
Do you have, now that you've mentioned gear, let's talk about some of your kind of favorite go-to pieces of gear, whether that's hardware, software. What do you love working on at the moment?
Well, I'll start answering that one by I love using whatever I've got around.
Great.
Because the most important thing is if you've got an idea and you need to record it, that you've got a microphone, something to record it, you hit record and then you hit play and it comes back. That's the most important thing. Excuse me. But when it comes to gear, like high-end gear, it just makes your job easier. Doesn't necessarily make it better. If you've got a Neumann microphone and a Neve preamp and you plug it in, it's probably going to sound pretty good.
Yeah.
There's not a lot you got to do. But that doesn't mean if you've got an SE microphone and a PreSonus preamp that you can't make it sound as good. You just might need to work a little bit harder. It might need a couple more plugins. You might need to move it somewhere different. You just might need to work a little bit harder. So, I'm sorry to give you an obtuse answer to your question, but, because I could just, run off all the cliche, a Neumann U47 through a Neve 1073 with a LA2A or a 1176. Of course I love all that shit and it's great. But at the same time, I'm totally into the UAD Apollo gear and the emulations are pretty good. My PhD kind of looked at the kind of more traditional large format recording studio and then recording bands using an Apollo and a laptop in a house. And I didn't really find there was, like if you work hard on your laptop, you can do whatever you want. And, you could say I kind of did my research before I kind of, went down that road. So, I love the UAD Apollo stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's super important what you've just said. It's like, and that's been my mentality from the start, is always just use what I've got and try and get it to where it's listenable. And like that is where being a good producer is like the case, and a mixer as well. It's like, it really, at the end of the day, like you said, it doesn't necessarily matter. Yeah, you got to have less work, but if you've got something that works and sounds good and you can work with it and get it to a place where that's all that matters at the end of the day. It's like, I've always had that. It's like, make do with what I've got. I might not have the best mics. I might not have the best computer or anything like that, but I'm going to work my ass off. And that, again, that's what makes a good producer or mixer, in my opinion.
It often comes down to that sort of time-money balance. And that's one thing I found in my PhD was, like if you walk into an amazing studio, you go to 301 and you plug in all the Neumanns, you're running through the Neve desk, everyone's happy, but you don't have a lot of time in there. You've got to get it done and get it done quickly, unless you're in the upper stratosphere of musicians. You're Taylor Swift on tour or wants to get an idea down. Sure, she can go in there for as long as she wants. She probably can't because she's got restrictions with time. But when you plug that gear in, it's going to sound good. If you're at home, you don't have that gear, but the thing you do have is time. You don't have that massive overhead of however many thousands of dollars a day it is to hire that equipment, but you've got time where you can work on it and work on it and work on it till you get it right. And that's kind of, as much as you don't want your head to go up your own arse and never get anything completed, it's also your main asset, particularly if you're starting out and you've just got a laptop and a microphone and an interface. Time is your biggest asset.
Absolutely. I love it. Well, before I finish up these talks, I always like to ask for what is your best piece of advice that you can think of for either producers and engineers and then artists?
Okay. I think for producers and engineers starting out, it's definitely just do it. Every time you do it, you'll feel like you're getting better. I've been doing it for more than 30 years now. I still feel the same way. Every time I get into the recording studio, I feel like I'm learning something and I'm getting better at my craft.
That's awesome.
Every time I'm mixing a song, I feel like I'm getting better at it. I want that feeling. So it's just do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the more experienced, it's probably, you probably don't need to say anything, but it's, the song is number one. It's all about the song, and it's trying to make the tools of the studio work for the song. You're just trying to capture performances and get an idea down. Don't get lost in what's right and wrong in the recording studio and, what's right, is it on the grid? Is it in tune? Yep. No one cares about that stuff. Is it communicating what it's meant to be communicating? What was the last one? There was for the artists. Yeah, I think for the artists, it's find someone you can trust. Like the studio, it's all about communication. So find someone you can trust. Find someone you can communicate with, and for an artist, like hold on to your ideas. Don't just sort of give all your agency to a producer because you feel like you don't understand the environment you're in. I think it's really important for artists now to have a good knowledge of the studio and what's going on. They should at least have the dialogue so that they can kind of talk about a sibilant vocal take or to try and communicate their ideas to a producer. So it's really finding someone you can communicate with and someone you can trust. And it might take a few goes. Don't just, spend one day in a studio and then write someone off. Yeah. It's really like try and communicate. And if you're not happy with something, just keep trying to get it to where you want. And it's persistence, like I feel like it's part of the job. I'm a pretty persistent person and I like it when people keep pushing me. No, it's not right yet, Magoo. Keep pushing, Usually most people are saying I've gone too far, which I don't mind. But yeah, be persistent and hold on to your ideas and communicate is kind of the big ones. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time and, it's really appreciated. And, as I said earlier, I love your work and, grew up listening to it. So, bit of a kind of a great moment for me, but thanks for your time. If anyone wants to reach out to you and have a chat, how can they do that?
Oh, well, I exist on the interwebs, but my website's magoosound.com. So you can hit me up there. But, you know, I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. I'm not super active, but I'm there. So, you know, you can always DM me and, you know, yeah. But, yeah, like if you ask me for a recording, I'm probably going to say I probably don't have time unless there's some kind of massive research project involved. Research is the only way I can really record anymore. But yeah, mixing is something I still do. I don't have a huge output, but I still love mixing and, you know, hit me up. You never know.
Beautiful. Well, thanks again, mate. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Stu. This has been awesome.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks to everyone that has checked this out. You do us a favor, do all the usual stuff. Subscribe, follow, share it on your DMs in a conversation. Spread the word. We want to get this out to as many people as possible. And thanks again, and we will see you next time on What's That Sound podcast.
Thanks for listening to What's That Sound? Make sure you hit follow or subscribe on your podcast platform to stay up to date with each new episode. We'll catch you next time.